Directors of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We're very happy to be back at the University Club. We were sad during the downtime. The university was renovating the place, but obviously the renovation went well. We're very happy to be back. It is my responsibility in these shindigs to be biographies of the speaker and moderator. So, I'm going to go ahead and launch into that, and I apologize if don't throw anything at me if I butcher this. All right, I'm going to start with Dr. Tegan Blaine, the Director of Climate, Environment, and Conflict at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior to joining USIP in 2020, she served as Vice President on the Climate Change Initiative at the National Geographic Society. She also led the climate change team in USAID's Bureau for Africa for over a decade, where she developed USAID's strategy and investment plan for its climate change work in Africa, and built and led a team that provided thought leadership and technical support to USAID's African missions. For USAID, Dr. Blaine worked on climate change and international development at McKinsey & Company, served as a policy advisor on water at the U.S. Department of State, and taught math and physics as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. Dr. Blaine has a doctorate in oceanography and climate from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and bachelor's degrees in comparative literature and mathematical ecology from Brown University. She has taught about climate change and international development at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs and Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you for coming, Dr. Blaine. Ryan Van Belzer. Ryan Van Belzer is the Energy and Environment reporter at Louisville Public Media. He'll be moderating the talk tonight. He's dedicated to covering climate change and environmental issues across Kentucky. Ryan graduated with a bachelor's degree in journalism from Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University and has more than a decade of experience in the industry. He's worked for the Arizona Republic, the Associated Press, the South Florida Sun Sentinel, and as a travel reporter in Central America and Southeast Asia. He has won numerous awards, including Regional Edward R. Murrow Awards, Associated Press Broadcasters Awards, and Society of Professional Journalists Louisville Pro Chapter Awards. He is also very soon to be married, so let's give him a round of applause. Again, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to turn it over to our guests here. Thank you.
Good evening. The microphone's on, right? Okay. I'm Tegan Blaine, and I'm a former teacher, as was discussed. So is it okay if, oh, I forgot that you're recording that. Do you want me to sit down? Thank you. Thank you. I promise I'll sit down with Ryan eventually. Well, I was asked to give a 10 or 15 minute kind of introduction to climate change and security issues. And so we thought that we'd start with that, and then we'll go into a kind of fireside chat, if I may call it, without the fire here in the front, if that sounds okay. Speak up a little bit? I'll try to hold this closer. Does that work? I don't know how to deal with the volume issue.
Mic, I think, was a little bit louder. Let's see if that's really true.
How's this?
There we go.
Well, I hope I don't blow you out of your seats now. I am currently the director for the Program on Climate, Environment, and Conflict at the U.S. Institute of Peace. How many have heard of the U.S. Institute of Peace? Oh, wow. I'm quite impressed. Yeah. Well, for those of you who don't know it, the U.S. Institute of Peace was founded in 1984 under President Reagan, but the ideas behind the U.S. Institute of Peace date from the George Washington era. It is a federally funded institute, but it is meant to be nonpartisan. Let me see if I can get my vocabulary here just so that I get it. A national, nonpartisan public institution that is dedicated to preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict abroad. And so some of you might say, why is an institute like that working on climate change? And I'm here to tell you why this evening. I arrived at the U.S. Institute of Peace about 3 years ago, in part because the people who had been working on peace building around the world were beginning to recognize that climate change was beginning to impact their work, and other environmental issues was beginning to impact their work. They increasingly saw it as a cause resulting in conflict. And so the agency, or the institute as a whole, decided that they really needed to build up a program in this area. And so I came on board to develop the program, which we launched officially a couple of years ago. Now, I was already having a conversation with some of the people here about what security means. How many people think of security as a defense-related issue? See, I'm a former student. I'm going to make you be active. I hope you're okay with that, or a former teacher. So a good number of people think of security as a defense-related issue. How many people think of it as a human issue? Okay, sounds good. Climate security originally was conceived as something that was very defense-oriented, but increasingly the US government and people like me are beginning to think of climate security in a much more expansive way. And what we're thinking about when we use that term is how climate change impacts things like food security. Do you have enough to eat? Is your land producing enough for you to be able to feed your family over the coming year? It's also impacting things like water security and whether you have enough water to drink and to use for household needs. It's impacting health security. Are there new diseases? And for example, in Washington, D.C., we were talking about this as well earlier today. Washington, D.C. used to be a very malaria-prone area, but there hadn't been local cases of malaria for the last 40 or 50 years. This summer saw the first local transmission of malaria in Washington, D.C. So that's a health security issue. And so climate change, because of its impacts on heat and rainfall and sea level rise and changing winds and all sorts of things, is beginning to impact all of these human security issues and impact how we can and can't live our lives. And that, to me, is a climate security issue. But then all of these things have knockoff impacts. When people are insecure and are looking for ways to feed their families, they start making different choices. So we begin seeing conflicts around resources. Maybe not as much here, but certainly in Africa, for example, where I've worked for a long time. Conflicts over land, conflicts over water, conflicts over forests, in part because people are trying to figure out how to provide for their own families. We also see failure of government to support people in these kinds of instances. And so people develop grievances against government. They ask, why isn't government there when we need it? And so those grievances can also escalate. We see shifts in power dynamics. Climate change is going to favor some groups and some people over others. And so what does that mean as those power dynamics begin to shift within communities? And so all of these things lead to another set of decisions. What would you do if you were faced with these kinds of things? I'd probably look to how I can provide for my family, right? And what that means in many communities around the world is if violent and extremist groups are acting in an area, oftentimes they can promise individuals, we'll figure out how to get food for your family. We'll figure out how to get water for your family. We'll give you a reason to live and something to identify with at a time when you are feeling as though you are unable to define yourself by being able to provide for your family. And that means that it's easier to recruit people to violent and extremist groups. Those grievances against government for not coming through can begin escalating to the point where you have significant political unrest and potentially even political violence. So all of these things begin to happen. We see conflicts between communities escalate. We see conflicts between countries escalate. Transboundary water issues, who gets that? Who doesn't? You can see how that begins to escalate as well. We see geopolitical tensions escalate. All of that can go back in certain ways to climate change. Now, I would never say that all of that is due to climate change. Climate change is one factor among many complicating factors where governments can't always deliver on their promises or even try to deliver on their promises, where relationships between countries are defined by a whole host of stresses. But climate change can be one additional stress on communities, on individuals, on countries, on relationships internationally that can really complicate everything. And I would say that that's playing out even in the United States in ways that we're just beginning to see, but are probably 10 or 20 years ahead in places like Africa. When hurricanes hit, and we're probably going to see, more hurricanes because of climate change, and FEMA doesn't always deliver the resources that it needs to deliver. How is that going to impact the level of trust we have in the US government to provide, for example? That was also the case in eastern Kentucky after the floods last year, that FEMA wasn't fully able to deliver. And so it undermines trust in government. What does it mean when you can't fully rebuild, for example? How are we going to deal with, as a country, with the fact that insurance companies are moving out of places in California and Florida, and people don't even have the capacity to rebuild if they're hit by disasters? All of these things are beginning to become a little bit evident in the United States, but are already very evident in many different places around the world. Now, there's one major issue I haven't brought up yet. If I can't find a job in Washington, D.C., what's one thing that I might do? Move. I might move to Louisville because I was offered a job at the university, or I might move to California because I can see another future for myself, in the tech industry or something like that. Migration is both a really important way to address some of those human insecurity concerns, and it's a risk for conflict. In the climate change community, we think of migration as actually a good thing because people are responding to the stresses in their lives, and they're moving in order to reduce those stresses. They're moving for economic opportunities. They're moving to protect their families and develop ways to take care of their families. And so at least in the climate change community, that's a positive. That is a response to climate change that could actually help you address some of the stresses of climate change. However, there's another side to that. When people move, they might be welcomed by the communities they're moving to. Or sometimes they aren't. And that can put stresses on government services, stresses between the individuals entering a community and the individuals who already live there about who's really a citizen and who really has rights to, health care and education and so on. So the whole issue about migration and displacement can be both a climate adaptation and a climate security risk, because it can, in certain cases, complicate many of the things that I've talked about. So there's one other point I'd like to make before we begin this conversation, I think. What I've been talking about so far is how communities are responding to the stresses of climate change. There's also the question about how we are actually beginning to reduce the causes of climate change, which in the climate change community gets called mitigation. How do we mitigate the causes of climate change, or how do we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change? What is happening that helps do that? Yes, electric cars. What else? Solar power, yes. Wind power, right? Managing forests and regrowing forests sometimes, managing agricultural systems and looking for ways to preserve carbon in soils, which also helps with your productivity, which is a great win-win, right? These kinds of things often we perceive as very positive things, and they are. In order to deal with climate change, we have to move on a path that is going to be in the direction of energy systems that don't release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and better management of land and so on. The issue is that there are risks of conflict in those pathways that we often don't talk about. Right now, there is significant new mining for minerals that will go into batteries for electric cars. Many of those minerals are in poorly run countries, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the government is not exactly functional a lot of the time. And so as companies move in to mine these minerals, there are risks of conflict over land. There are risks of conflict over pollution. There are risks of conflict over human rights issues and labor issues that can result in a lot of localized conflicts. We are also increasingly beginning to see tensions on the international level. So for example, China has a national policy to try to ensure that they know how they're going to source the minerals that will feed development of green technologies. The United States has no national policy. We expect the private sector to do that. But that difference in how we approach sourcing the minerals that will feed a green energy sector is really going to determine who controls those technologies, how they're sold, who gets to make them and use them, and so on. And so it can begin feeding international tensions as well. China is already looking at deep sea mining for some of those minerals and even beginning to explore space options for mining some of those minerals. And the United States isn't quite there yet. And so there's a potential for conflict there. We often think green energy is the solution, and that's true in so many different ways. But another way that this is translating into the kinds of conflict that I have to worry about is, for example, the fights over land tenure around wind energy, for example. In the United States, it tends to be a NIMBY issue, not in my backyard. In Africa, for example, oftentimes governments look to establish wind energy in areas where land ownership is a little bit up in the air. People are farming areas where they don't actually have land rights or where they're community rights, so no one individual actually has rights to the land. So it's very easy to kick those people off the land and use that land to establish wind energy, for example. And so there are disputes around land tenure. There are also disputes about the benefit sharing, because in many of these countries, the areas where wind energy is going in are areas that don't actually have access to grid energy, and they see the energy generated going into large transmission lines to feed capital cities, for example. Already, Kenya in Africa, which is one of the better managed countries, has lost hundreds of $millions in private sector deals, specifically because of conflicts over land and benefit sharing resulting from wind energy deals. And so those deals just aren't going through. And so this is a situation where actually being thoughtful about what communities need and how they benefit from these kinds of investments could actually reduce the risk of conflict and allow us to implement these kinds of technologies more easily. So when we talk about climate security, we're talking about all of these issues. We're talking about the family that is struggling to grow enough food to feed its own family or sell enough to be able to pay for school fees. We're also talking about some of these issues related to grievances with government or even transboundary or geopolitical tensions. So that's my introduction to climate security issues. I know we're going to have a good conversation, and we're going to go in very different places now. I'll leave it there for the early remarks.
I talk really loud, so I'll hold on to this quieter one. Can you all hear me on this mic? Great. Okay. I'd like to start the conversation by learning more about what you do at the U.S. Institute of Peace, or for Peace.
Good question. We're still figuring it out. So the U.S. Institute of Peace is this weird institution that works partially on policy options and partially on on-the-ground solutions to conflict. And so we have offices in between 15 and 20 countries at any given time in some of the choice locations around the world: Sudan, Iraq, many of those kinds of places.
Easy places to
solve issues, yes. When I first started at the U.S. Institute of Peace, I was asked to initially develop a portfolio that was very focused on policy options and policy issues. And so that's where our program has been so far, really beginning to work on some of the academic issues that are critical, like what approaches are actually useful to resolving conflict within transboundary water agreements, for example. How do we raise the issues related to conflict on climate security in ways that negotiators are willing to take on these pathway questions? But we are increasingly beginning to explore how we work on some of the on-the-ground issues with our local offices. So, for example, we're currently working with a program that builds the ability of local community organizations, grassroots organizations, to work on policy issues in their country in nonviolent ways. And so there, many of the institutions that USIP was already working with were really concerned about environmental issues. And so we're looking at ways to support these grassroots organizations to organize each other, to have a louder voice, to make a difference in their country in a way that is responsive to the needs of communities and is through nonviolent action. Just to give you a little bit there.
Wow, that's really interesting. You started your career, though, as a climate scientist?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit that, I don't want to date you, but you mentioned it earlier. It was in 1986 you were talking about climate change.
Yes, and I'm afraid the science was pretty settled by then too. So I actually grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, very close to here. And I started teaching at the Cincinnati Zoo when I was in 9th grade. I taught elementary students who were staying at the zoo overnight. And in 9th grade, when I was teaching at this program called Nocturnal Adventures at the Cincinnati Zoo, we were already talking about climate change. That's how settled the science was in 1986.
What's different now versus then?
It's happening faster. I think a couple of us were talking about this earlier today. If there's one thing that the scientific community got wrong, it's how fast climate change has evolved from something we thought was in the future to something that's happening now. As you referred, I did my PhD in climate science. What was I called? A geochemical physicist or something along those lines. I basically dealt with how the oceans are taking up carbon and oxygen and argon as a tracer for how much heat the ocean was absorbing. So I sat in a lab fiddling with equipment to make it very high precision. Even then, I think I did not expect to see the impacts of climate change as quickly as I have. And at the time, I'd already served in the Peace Corps in Africa. In the community where I was serving, I had already begun seeing the impacts of climate change on the community where I was living. But I did not expect it to be a worldwide phenomenon as quickly as has happened.
This seems like the perfect time to bring up this summer and what we've seen this summer. Can you describe, given your background, what you've seen this summer and what we've all seen this summer happening across the world, it being the hottest summer on record?
It's frightening. So everybody by now is probably familiar with El Nino, right? Which is a global kind of pattern of ocean temperatures that basically feeds the atmosphere and ocean and controls where there's drought and where there's flooding, where there's heat all around the globe. And so one of the things that we've seen from a scientific standpoint is that the El Nino signal, which used to kind of go up and down every 5 to 7 years, is becoming significantly stronger. That's one of the things that I saw when I was working as Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania in the mid-1990s. Even then, the El Nino signal in East Africa, where it's fairly strong, was already getting stronger. And we're really seeing the impacts of it this year.
And we've seen the impacts it's on natural disasters, these Canadian wildfires, which, by the way, the smoke came down through Louisville and even was affecting here. We've seen these floods happening in countries all over the world, in places like Libya and Hong Kong. But we've also seen dramatic changes happening in the oceans, and given your background on oceans, I was wondering if you could talk about that and how that might affect us.
Ooh, now you're asking me to pull out that part of the brain that used to be a scientist but is really a policymaker nowadays. The ocean impacts are so important. Traditionally, when carbon dioxide, so the most important greenhouse gas, went up in the atmosphere, it would get absorbed by the ocean. And so carbon dioxide was not increasing as fast as it could have in the atmosphere because the ocean would take up part of that. If you look at gas exchange between the air and the water, it would even out. And so a lot of that carbon dioxide was ending up in the ocean. That's also true of heat. And so the water on the earth is enormous. There is so much water, and water heats up a lot slower than air does. And so for many, many years, the Earth's climate was actually buffered by the ocean. We were not seeing the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we were also not heating up as fast as we could have because the ocean was taking on a lot of that. That balance is shifting. And at this stage, the ocean the amount of carbon dioxide that it can absorb is dropping. The amount of heat that the ocean can absorb is also dropping, basically because the surface ocean is saturated. And it takes a long time for the water of the ocean to drop in the North Atlantic and to resurface around the world. And so once that layer of water is really warm, it's not going to take up much heat. And so the changes in the ocean are meaning that it's becoming a more and more limited buffer for the rest of us, which means that the impacts of climate change that we feel on land is going to increase more quickly.
I want to talk about one more of those kinds of technical impacts. Let's talk about the albedo effect and the melting of the glaciers and how that impacts heat. I don't know if I'm not.
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
So ice operates as a mirror. And, well, let me take a step back. Climate change is happening because of something called the radiative balance of the Earth. The sun emits radiation that we see as light and heat, and that comes in through our atmosphere. There are already chemicals in the atmosphere that reflect some of that radiation. So not all of the radiation gets through. A part of the radiation gets through, but it warms up the Earth, and the Earth then emits some of that radiation in a different wavelength. So what we see coming in as light from the sun actually goes out from the Earth looking like something different. And again, there are chemicals in the atmosphere that either let that radiation through or trap it close to the Earth. So what has happened with climate change is the chemicals that we're emitting as greenhouse gases have basically formed a layer in the atmosphere, and they operate exactly like a blanket. When we put a blanket over us, the wool in the blanket doesn't automatically get warm. What it does is it traps the heat from our body near us so that we basically get a layer of heat around our body, and that's why we get warm. That's why it takes 5 minutes to feel warm. And so the exact same thing is happening with the Earth. We have a layer of gases that are keeping that radiation close to the Earth and causing the Earth to heat up because that blanket is thicker than it used to be. Ice figures into this because ice kind of acts like a mirror. And some of that radiation that came in from the sun would get reflected out into space before it was absorbed by the Earth. But as ice starts to melt and you have normal soil exposed, it's much darker than ice. It doesn't act as a mirror, and it actually absorbs far more heat, which causes the ice to melt even faster. So this is something called a positive feedback loop, where once you get this going, it's almost impossible to stop. It just feeds on itself, and it keeps escalating faster and faster.
I'm so happy you brought that up. Yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, were these feedback loops. I think the thing that we have to realize as human beings is the impact that we have had on the planet. And I think that our forefathers, our ancestors, they looked out into the wilderness and they saw a world that was huge and impossible for them to ever control. And the world that we see today is very different. We see a world that is very fragile, that is interconnected and dependent upon each other for existence, as reflected in these feedback loops. And it's not just climate change, it's not just the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. You also have things like the nutrient loading of the Gulf of Mexico, all of the farm runoff, the phosphorus and nitrogen that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico and causes a dead zone. You have things like forever chemicals, PFAS chemicals, these novel pollutants that we're adding into the atmosphere. You have land use that limits biodiversity, like the lawns that we have. We have all of these ways that we are affecting the planet, and we have to realize this impact that we are having on the planet, and that impact is the stability that has existed for so long that humans have depended on for growth is changing. And so I'm curious to see or to hear from you some personal examples of your time with USAID in Africa, or your experiences in Africa, of times in which you have seen that stability fall apart, when you've seen a heat wave or a drought cause political instability. Could you give an example or two of that?
Of course I can. I just need to think of a couple of really good examples.
We were talking about Kenya earlier, which is the first.
Well, I could definitely do the Kenya example if you want. We were talking about how climate change results in political instability, and Kenya kind of is my favorite example right now because it's it's one that's really in my face. Kenya has had a series of presidential elections over the last decade that were very different presidential elections. The most recent one, there was no violence whatsoever, no political violence, no killings, no ethnic violence. It happened peacefully. The transfer of power happened peacefully. That is very different than what had happened 5 years before. At that time, Kenya was in the middle of a drought. People were hungry. They were concerned about their livelihoods. They were concerned about whether the government was going to come through for them. And Kenya has a little over 30 tribes that are not always, getting along perfectly. And so during that time, in the run-up to the elections, there ended up being significant political violence that turned into killings. And some of those turned into kind of ethnically motivated killings, which was a very different kind of run-up to the election. In the end, the transfer of power did happen, but the election was done or took place under very concerning circumstances. And it was not clear that that transfer of power was actually going to take place peacefully. So Kenya definitely invested in improved governance in the 5 years between those elections, but also at the next election, Kenya was not facing drought. It was not facing hunger. And from that perspective, they were in a much better situation to overcome some of the political and ethnic challenges that the country continually faces, in part because they didn't have that additional exacerbating impact of drought. that is increasing due to climate change.
I think about a term that the military often uses when talking about climate change. They call climate change a force multiplier. And I think that's a good way to think about the effects that climate change has on the world. And I wonder, when you think about the things happening in the world right now, I wonder if you might point out some of the resource issues that we have, or some of the ways that climate change might be a force multiplier or drive certain countries to do certain things. What I'm thinking of off the top of my head is China's actions in the South China Seas right now, trying to blockade other countries from entering what they perceive to be their territory.
Yes. The example I was thinking of, do you mind if I switch gears a little
Please
bit?
do.
Because
Please
I'm
do.
less familiar with the South China Seas issue. The Middle East is definitely not my specialty, but I recently had to teach a class at the Foreign Service Institute, which trains diplomats. And this was a class of Foreign Service officers heading to the Middle East who wanted a briefing on climate and conflict issues. So I had to get a little bit up to speed on things. Iraq is highly dependent upon rivers that originate in other countries, primarily Turkey and Iran. And in the past, there was plenty of water, and Iraq had enormous marshlands that generated significant fisheries. They grew dates, they grew other crops, fruit crops that were just amazingly productive. Increasingly over the last 20 years or so, both Iran and Turkey have been putting in dams that limit the water supply. In part, that's because those countries benefit from having those dams there. They can control the amount of water that they have for agriculture. They've had growing populations too. The water is also a source of energy through hydropower and so on. But it has resulted in less and less water making it to Iraq. And that is further exacerbated by climate change, reducing the overall amount of water. And so in areas of Iraq, areas that even 10 years ago grew dates, they are now completely dry. People don't have access to water. And basically, they are sometimes dependent upon the government bringing water to those communities. They're sending away family members to the cities to look for other jobs and other economic opportunities. It already was reaching crisis proportions because of the unilateral actions of its neighboring countries on what is a shared source of water. But in this situation, climate change has just exacerbated it to the point where it is an extremely severe situation. And Iraq doesn't have a lot of power in this situation. They don't have water, they can't enforce the water agreements that were made generations ago. They're not in a position to take on powerful neighbors like Turkey and Iran. And so the options for a country like Iraq and the communities that are directly affected are really devastating.
I've got just a couple more questions, and then I want to switch gears and we'll take some audience questions. In your role, what have you seen that have been policies, and what kinds of policies have been effective at improving stability in these regions, or sharing resources and finding ways to limit, I hate the word mitigate. I try and avoid it in my reporting.
Yes.
But limit the effects of climate change in these areas.
I think that we're seeing a lot more solutions at the very local level these days, and we are still facing enormous policy issues at kind of the larger geographic scale. At the local level, we are seeing efforts to build capacity among communities to address conflict with their neighbors, for example. And so there are many, many communities that are putting into place local water sharing agreements and developing ways for communities to resolve some of the conflicts over water, for example, or over land. There are areas in Africa where that have been traditional agricultural areas, and increasingly herding populations are being forced into those areas because water is going down, grasslands are going down, and it's very quick. Oftentimes there are ethnic differences between those populations. In one area in Nigeria where USIP works, traditional herding communities tend to be Muslim, and the farming communities tend to be Christian. And so it was quickly chalked up as a religious and ethnic conflict. But the reality was that herder populations were being squeezed, and they didn't have anywhere else to go. And so they were forced into areas where agriculture has been expanding. Just being able to sit back and recognize that this was not an ethnic conflict as much as it was a land conflict, and that land issues, there is an opportunity to solve them using discussion, dialogue, policy. All of those things helped relieve some of the pressure and reduce the risk of conflict between these neighboring communities. So there are areas like that where communities are building their skill set to work with their neighbors, to deal with shared resources that might be being reduced, but have the ability to engage together about how we make these decisions about management. Now we need that to happen on larger scales.
It's interesting to hear you, the ways in which what you're describing is dealing with the effects of a problem. Does the U.S. Institute of Peace have any role in dealing with the culprits behind the problem, which is largely fossil fuel industries and petrostates that are supporting the burning of fossil fuels?
That is a question we are asking ourselves. What is our role there? And so one of the things that my team and I are now taking on is basically re-envisioning what the major UN climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, might look like if we use different diplomatic pathways to achieve the goals. The Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015, is an amazing agreement. There are over 180 countries who signed on to that agreement. The UN doesn't have any other agreement of that size. It was a massive undertaking. And it took a significant partnership between the United States and China to both get on board with the agreement, to pull many of the countries of the world into that agreement. No other agreement in the UN has ever had that many signatories. It's astounding, but the agreement is failing. It's not delivering on its promises. And so one of the things that we're beginning to ask is, are there other diplomatic pathways or development pathways that we could explore that would help deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement without working through that pillar of the UN negotiations? Are there ways that we can use trade relationships? Are there ways that we can look at different kinds of development relationships? What can we do to use kind of the global space that we're in to actually achieve the goals of Paris, but without necessarily working in Paris? And I do think that there are real opportunities there, but I'll have a better answer next year.
That is really interesting. That is really interesting. And I'd love to ask a bunch more questions about that, but I'll leave it to the audience to ask the next set of questions. If I walk that way, am I going to get a lot of feedback from that micro? Okay, I'm going to walk behind this speaker here.
I'll take this and maybe you can. Sounds good.
Yeah.
I'll ask you one more on the Armageddon question, and that is, clearly, as we've stated, there is more and more forced migration based on heat and food at the same time that countries are becoming much more autocratic and resistant to that movement. At the same time, more and more countries are getting nuclear weapons. And at least in dark times of the night, I really worry about the Armageddon potential outcome of this.
I think that's a really valid concern. There has been quite a bit of discussion about the potential for migration and displacement due to climate change. The operating assumption is, at least in the short term, that probably isn't going to be cross-border. It's going to be people moving within their own countries, moving from rural areas to urban areas and so on. But as we begin to look out, the potential for real movements across borders is absolutely a reality. I still read some of the academic literature on the science of climate change, and one article that came out 2 years ago, I think, has been really influential in my thinking about some of the issues that we need to take on. And basically what it said is that, human population lives in a relatively narrow area of the land mass, and less than 1% of the land mass is exposed now to the temperatures that by 2070 are going to affect 30% of the global population if we don't move. That's northern India, that's Pakistan, that's a lot of Sahelian and North Africa, that cuts across to northern Latin America, the Central America. There are massive areas of the world that are going to be experiencing temperatures that are not particularly sustainable for human life. And either we have to adapt our societies to deal with that, or we have to move. And what is that going to mean? We have time to prepare for that, but we have to actually start now, and we need to start developing the diplomatic pathways to deal with such massive societal change. When you start talking about nuclear weapons and so on, it becomes really frightening. Personally, I prefer to have hope that the enormity of these problems will actually motivate us to collaborate better and to begin having the difficult conversations that we, as a society and as an international body, absolutely have to have. I'll leave it there.
I'll add one thing, that the changes that, we are going to see incredible changes in the next few decades as a result of climate change and the instability that it creates. And the United States in particular doesn't have a large appetite right now for some of the large changes that will need to be happening, that will need to take place, although that is changing rapidly. The most important thing that we can do as citizens in local, state, and federal government is have plans in place so that when these changes do happen, we can have the necessary plans in place to adapt to the changing world as it happens.
Actually, could I build off of that?
Yeah, please.
One of the best case, one of the most important examples to me right now is an example from Bangladesh, where the government is already thinking about how to encourage the growth of secondary cities away from the major riverine systems that are flooding significantly. This is not a quick solution to move people away from the river systems, but what they're beginning to think about is how do we identify secondary cities that are in safer locations? How do we begin to lure people there? And what does it take to lure people? Why don't we build universities in those cities so students come? And oftentimes students like to stay where they studied, and the education helps them create new economic opportunities. So these universities might be economic drivers of growth that further pull additional people away from some of the riskier territories to the cities. Now, this is very much in the planning stage. It's going to take years to make this happen. But the fact that the Bangladeshi government is already thinking about this and already beginning to figure out how to invest in secondary cities so that people want to move there and want to move away from the much riskier territories is definitely, to me, a very hopeful movement.
Thanks for this. Great, fantastic. Sort of on a similar theme, I think you started with the question about security as a military we start using the word security, and people think in terms of putting more people with guns in place there. So big picture, how do you talk about that to sort of both reclaim the term security without losing the whole initiative to a military orientation about China?
You get the military to start talking about security in human terms. And you know, one thing that I've been working on for the last couple of years is about this time, 2 years ago, the US Africa Command approached the US Institute of Peace and said, hey, do you have anybody working on climate change issues? We're really concerned about climate issues in Africa and what that's going to mean to us. And so for the last couple of years, I've been working with the US Africa Command on climate security issues in Africa.
Wow.
The first types of questions that they were asking were along the lines of, what's going to happen that's going to demand our services? What's going to happen that's going to undermine governments and mean that we are being called in? What kinds of disasters are going to happen where we're asked to come in to help with humanitarian assistance? Do we need to worry about migrants flooding cities and suddenly major conflicts in cities because we don't know how to operate in cities, and that's an entire skill set that we need to learn? That's how the conversation began 2 years ago. At this stage, what the conversation is we need to partner with other parts of the government to address food security so that people have what they need and the recruitment to armed and extremist groups is not successful. And so this year in June, I went to Botswana with the US Africa Command and our two institutions, together with the Botswana Defense Force, hosted a meeting of security professionals from over 34 countries in Africa to talk about climate change. And we talked about what these professionals were seeing in terms of impacts. We talked about what they were afraid about in their countries. We talked about everything. We talked about energy. We talked about migration. We talked about the changing relationship with the military where, you know, in certain countries, the military is the only part of the government that actually owns helicopters and owns planes. And so when an emergency happens, they're the ones who end up providing some of that humanitarian assistance because there's no other branch of government that can do that. And what does that mean for civilian-military relationships and how those might evolve? The conversation these days with the US Africa Command is very much now about prevention. It's not about how they'll develop and advance the military capacities to deal with climate security, you know, whatever down the line. I can't say risks any longer, you know, events or something. The conversation is now, how can they work to prevent these kinds of things? How do they partner with countries in Africa to prevent these kinds of things? How do they work more effectively with what we call the 3 Ds of US government: defense, diplomacy, and development assistance? So how do we draw upon all 3 of those areas to actually get ahead of the curve? That's a new conversation for the military, and it means that the military is now beginning to think about security not just as guns, but as those human dimensions and what that means for how the military can contribute to getting ahead of the curve so that they aren't called in at some point. Again, a little bit of hope.
I want to talk about the development assistance side of things because it seems to me finance is really critical, and in particular, finance flows and de-risk investments, de-risk resilient systems and societies, because the poor suffer the most, without question. It's Eastern Kentucky, it's Mozambique, it's the same story. I'm Jerry Skees. I was a professor at the University of Kentucky for 35 years. I'm an institutional economist. I'm a development economist. So for me, I started a company, British German government, and we do financial in order to actually get the financing needed before a country goes from one classification of food insecurity into the most severe classifications. So I guess I'm really pointing, you haven't mentioned much about finance and development, but you have that development background, so I'd like to push you in that direction.
Thank you for that. And finance really is important. It's just that I deal with finance less than I used to when I worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development. You know, I do think that the private sector engagement in climate change and access to finance to support that kind of work is absolutely critical. It is not a panacea, not at all. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work to increase finance. We absolutely should. You know, many years ago, there was a commitment as part of the UN negotiations on climate change that the world would try to put at least $100 billion into climate change investment or climate change activities on an annual basis. And a lot of people interpreted that as that money is going to come from the rich countries to the poor countries. That was not the commitment. The commitment was we are going to work towards that number as public money, as private money, as developing countries, as developed countries. Everything was under consideration. And people sometimes forget that part of the commitment. You know, I think that there are things that finance is good at and things where we have still failed to figure out how to enable the private sector to come up with good solutions. And getting back to not liking to use the word mitigation, at least within the climate change community, we talk a lot about mitigation, which is how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change, and adaptation. How do we deal with climate change that's already happening? I think the private sector is doing a great job on the mitigation side. The rate of change of the development of green technologies is just beginning to skyrocket. Prices are dropping faster than we can really even kind of conceive of and adapt to from an economic standpoint. Like the price of wind energy and so on is just dropping to the point where in many countries around the world, it's a far better financial investment than traditional forms of energy generation. That said, adaptation really struggles to attract investment. There are particular areas that do get investment, like trying to develop drought-resistant seeds. But a lot of these technologies that are developed are very hard to get picked up by communities and really become effective. And they're developed with one particular problem in mind instead of an evolving set of problems that is expanding really fast. And so many, many years ago, at the beginning of the Obama administration, when I was at USAID, we met with a range of companies who really wanted to be able to invest in adaptation, and all of them were struggling. The question that I heard again and again and again is, we don't know how to invest in technologies that are going to pay us back. We still have to answer to shareholders, and many of the things that we're talking about are investments in public goods. And I think we're really still in that stage. There are technological solutions that are fixes, but a lot of them are temporary fixes. And a lot of what we need to do on the adaptation side are investing in public good level things, which is much more difficult to figure out how to engage the private sector. And so there are critical ways, like insurance is a real option and different kinds of innovative insurance, but even experimentation with that often results in the fact that for insurance to work in developing countries, it needs to be subsidized. Lena Heron, your former colleague, taught me that oftentimes, I'm sorry? Well, at least some of the work that she was doing and investing in insurance options at the time basically needed to be subsidized in order for them to work in Ethiopia and northern Kenya, if I remember correctly. And so I do think that there are options that are definitely worth exploring, but we are going to have to think about very new ways to look for finance and use investment options. And we also need to recognize that certain areas are probably not suited for private sector finance, and we really need to invest in societal goods to overcome some of these issues. Do you want to add? I'm sorry? Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
I'll add that I think that in the future, right now actually, the world will have to come up with new ways of finance, new financial instruments that incentivize storing carbon or preventing carbon from being burned, because as long as the market incentivizes the burning of carbon, we are going to continue to contribute to the problem. And I'll bring it back to Kentucky briefly. Just before I came here, I wrote off a quick radio story about legislation passed in Kentucky 2 years ago that is now coming to fruition. 2 years ago, or I'm sorry, 2 years, last year, the legislature passed a bill that boycotts financial institutions that boycott fossil fuel industries. It bans financial institutions. The state will no longer do business with financial institutions that boycott the fossil fuel industry, and that is happening right now here in Kentucky. Well, it's not, I mean, it's more than the coal industry. But yes, but it is the coal industry. Yes, it is Kentucky and it is the coal. Yeah, but oil and gas too. Yeah.
I guess mine is sort of on that, which is never welcome at Q&A, but anyway. But I would love a response. So, I mean, Ryan, you just said market, right? And you were talking about public goods. We don't really have public goods in the United States anymore. We have private goods, which used to, once upon a time, like utilities were public goods. And it's not just the U.S. We have a complete mindset that I would argue we have also exported globally against the whole idea of public goods, and that the whole idea of them is even acceptable. So I think we have to change the mindset to do that, and I'm wondering how we do that. If you agree that we need the mindset change.
What's your answer to that one?
Well, I would dispute that we don't have public goods. We have national parks and national lands, and we provide mining licenses on those national lands. We provide ranching licenses, and that is a public good that we theoretically should benefit from in different ways, perhaps, than we currently are. I would love to see a lot of the prices on those, licensing options significantly increase to be more reflective of the costs of environmental damage and so on. I personally wrestle with many of the challenges that our society is facing right now, because there really is a difference between an individual mindset and a mindset that values the community well-being rather than the individual well-being. And, I wrestle with how to build that kind of community well-being mindset in my girls. I've got young girls who are growing up who are going to be the next generation of leaders, and how do I strengthen that mindset in them so that when they grow up, they keep kind of those community benefits and then the priorities of the communities in mind, even if it goes against their personal interests. And quite honestly, I don't know how we start to rebuild that. I do think that we need it, especially dealing with climate change issues. We need it at a global level. We don't just need it at a national level, although that would be a good start, but we really need it at a global level. And quite frankly, I worry with what I can do in my own life to contribute to that, and then how we as a society start to rebuild that. Just because I do have young kids, I read about school education systems in other areas of the world, and I've really been struck by some of the school education systems in particularly Scandinavian countries that work specifically as part of the curriculum on building more of that community mindset. And how we move our own educational system in that direction, I'm not sure, given the current politics right now, but I do think that it's absolutely important.
I'll just add briefly that, we have traditional societies all over this planet for thousands and tens of thousands of years practiced forms of religion that preached acting in harmony with nature. It's one of the, those are our oldest religions. And I'm not a particularly religious person myself, but there are mindsets that exist in the world that have existed for generations that we need to apply to modern thinking. We need to, maybe traditional to ancient thinking, which is that we need to act in harmony with nature. And it's not just religious change, although perhaps it is, but that should play a role. Actually, here in Kentucky, we have something called Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light. This is a group, and there's another one too, Seeds for the... Seeds of Hope, is that what it's called? There are religious communities here in Kentucky of different faith traditions who are working together to try and bridge the divide and help people of faith further understand the climate change and the things that have to happen in society. But these changes in mindset happen at many different levels. They can happen at a political level, they can happen at a religious level, they can happen at a spiritual level, they can happen at a societal level, and they all need to happen at the same time. As Antonio Guterres of the UN likes to say, everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yes.
Yeah. Last question?
This all kind of ties into what I was thinking about, and that is deforestation in Brazil and palm oil plantations in South Asia and Malaysia and Australia. And these are government policies that are allowing all massive destruction. Brazil is tearing down the forests of the Amazon, which is cutting down the rainfall of the Andes. The Andes glaciers are melting. All of the Peruvian Andes is going to be a desert eventually, which means there will be no water, east of the Amazon or west of the Amazon. So, at what point do we tell these governments don't do this? At what point do we tell these, the corporations that are driving all of this, you have to stop using palm oil in every cookie and cracker on the planet. This and we as consumers. You can sit there all day and read the ingredients, and every single one of them has palm oil in it. So we have no control. We can't, other than stop buying food. But at what level is it international? Is it governmental? Is it local? Is it individual? How do we address it at this level?
I think that's an issue that people haven't solved yet. Because what can happen in these kinds of situations when we try to use our influence with other countries is they will look back to us and say, clean up your own problems first. And there's a lot of truth to that. There is also the issue of sovereignty. And we don't want anybody getting messed up in our business, so we need to be respectful of other countries and find different ways to pull rather than to push. But I do think that we do need to look internally and think about our own kinds of responsibilities as a country, at the state level, at the city level, as individuals, and really think about what we can do differently as well. It was interesting. I have traveled all over Africa, especially when I was with USAID, and very early in that time, so probably around 2007, 2007, when I started working at USAID, if I remember correctly. And, I remember traveling with some colleagues in Mozambique, and they turned to me in the car and said, so, what is the United States doing on these issues since you're here to work on climate change in our country? And increasingly over the years, I got fewer and fewer of those questions as climate change became so in your face in Africa. But we have to be prepared to answer those questions and talk about what we're doing. The United States has made enormous gains, and it's something that we should be proud of in many ways. We actually are looking to a future where we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We are moving towards cleaner energy systems. And we're doing it because of private sector investment in those things. Some of it's being driven by policy in Washington, and some of it's being driven because of the economics of the technologies. And that is adding up. That really is adding up. And the United States is able to go to the UN negotiations and say, look, we're actually on a path to meeting our goals. But other countries will say, well, why aren't your goals more ambitious? You're asking us to be ambitious in our goals. Why aren't you increasing your own ambition and using all of the tools in your arsenal to actually achieve more? And that is a really valid question. You want to say it?
Hi, how's this better? Well, if you will all just join me in thanking Dr. Blaine and Ryan for our conversation tonight. A round of applause. So, climate change is one of these topics that sometimes it's so hard to tackle because there are so many issues that's evolved, and we had a lot of conversations today talking about how it's so related to a lot of the other topics that we tend to focus on at a global level. And sometimes, increasingly, as Dr. Blaine and Ryan was talking about, a lot of the things that we've talked about, whether it's, geopolitical security and rivalries and all of these things, there's this underpinning of what the climate situation, the environment is a big factor that we haven't traditionally really thought about, and that is becoming more and more of a factor. So it's one of those topics that I think there's a lot of constant reminder in our communities. It's local, it's global. I mean, it's something that we're going to be dealing with in many decades to come. So I really appreciate the fact that Dr. Blaine is able to share with us that global perspective. Sometimes we kind of tend to not remember that we live in a bigger world. Of course we do, but we are becoming very localized and tribal with many of the things that we do. So sometimes it's very difficult to think about that. But then also having Ryan, who's been an amazing reporter on all things environmental. So we appreciate having him in our community. We hope he will stay. And we're losing people left and right, like, please stay and continue with all this wonderful work, because we need this kind of information more than ever, this education with the community. So I want to thank all of you for turning out. Climate is one of these topics that we talked about. Just last week, it's been the focus of Climate Week in New York, of course, a big UN focus, but it's hard for us to talk about it at the local level because it's hard to know where do we even start. So thank you for turning out. And I would just say, if you are concerned and you care about how that local intersects with the global, let your people know, let your network, let your friends, let your students, let your kids, people who really, might not otherwise see that connection. I think it's more important than ever for us to make that connection for them. And, the World Affairs Council really try to do that by having these kinds of very important conversations. They seem to be global, they seem to be very much out there. What does that have to do with me? But of course, as we've heard today, everything, right? Everything we do has an impact at the global level and vice versa. So I think if you can all be our kind of ambassadors and our supporters out there, just let everybody know this is important. It's important for us to know what's happening globally as well as locally. So if you're not a member, please become one. I know many of you are, and thank you for your support because we appreciate you always. So thanks for coming out, and thank you again to Dr. Blaine and Ryan for this wonderful conversation. We will be having more of this conversation later on in this coming year, because climate change is one of the topics we'll be exploring in this World Transition Speaker Series. So if you have any suggestions, anything you really want to hear that we haven't touched on, please let us know through our website. And then lastly, just housekeeping. If you signed up to join us for dinner tonight, and if you want to take a drink with you, because after all that conversation, it's a little bit late. But if you like that, please make sure you order the drinks before you head into dinner. And that's all for now. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you
That was
so
really
much.
good. That was really good.
It went in totally different areas than I expected to go.
Me too, but it was that was fascinating.